Coming up on The World Today, the U.S. backs the WTO's move to temporarily lift patent protections for coronavirus vaccines. Global supplies reaching India are said to not be getting to those who really need them amid the surge in COVID-19 cases there. Plus, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says his country will respond to Russia's reckless or aggressive acts. A warm good evening to you and a warm good evening to our viewers here in Nigeria and around the world. Thanks for joining us. I'm Amarachi Ubani in Lagos. The U.S. government is supporting a move by the World Trade Organization to temporarily lift patent protections for coronavirus vaccines. Advocates of the move say it would increase global vaccine production, but drugs manufacturers argue it will not have the desired effect. Critics say it strips financial rewards from cutting-edge drug developers, but the decision by the U.S. President Joe Biden comes amid pressure from Democrats in his party to remove patent protections. In announcing the new policy, U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai said extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. She said the U.S. would now embark on negotiations at the WTO to try to secure the waiver, but warns that this could take time. The VOA's White House senior correspondent Patsy Widakuswara joins us now. She is in Washington. Patsy, thanks for joining us. What does this mean in the long run?
Well, just because the U.S. has agreed to support this proposal to waive patent protections, intellectual property protections on vaccines at the World Trade Center, this is a proposal that was put forward by South Africa and India in October of 2020. November 2020. That doesn't mean that American pharmaceutical companies will start giving away vaccine recipes, if you will, because the WTO is a consensus-based organization. So even though the U.S. agrees and more than 100 countries agree to this proposal, but there are still holdouts, including the European Union, Japan, and Switzerland, and several other countries. Now, some of these countries have come forward and said that they are open to discussion. So definitely the fact that the U.S. has agreed to support the waiver puts political pressure on these other countries to support it as well. What happens after all the countries agree in principle to waive the vaccine patents, then the countries will start negotiating on a text-based negotiation on the logistical and legal details of this patent issues. And don't forget that this is a very complicated legal matter. There is no one vaccine recipe, as I said, in quotes, because each vaccine has attached to it dozens, if not hundreds, of intellectual property protections, not just patents, but all sorts of other protections. So this process could take months, even if all the other countries also support the waiver at the WTO.
So in the long run, I mean, this would impact vaccines that are made in the near future, but who benefits the most?
I think that would benefit the most are lower and middle income countries who are saying to wealthy countries like the U.S. and Europe, we don't need you to give us excess doses. We don't need those donations of vaccine doses. We want to make our own, and we want to be sure that when we make our own, no company, no country is going to sue us because we're doing it. And that's essentially what the waiver means. It means that other countries, including middle-income countries who have the capacity, can start making their own generic versions for the vaccines, can start giving it to either their population or sharing it with other countries. So this will benefit overall vaccine outreach to the rest of the world, as well as vaccine inequity. As we know right now, more than 1.2 billion doses of vaccines have been delivered in the world. That's about 16 in every 100 people. But there's a huge disparity, a shocking imbalance, as the WHO calls it, in terms of who's been getting the vaccine. Some countries like the US, more than 50% of its population has gotten at least one shot, but there are also other countries who have not even delivered a single shot. So definitely this will improve the issue of vaccine inequity around the world.
Now I imagine the pharmaceutical companies may be kicking against this. How will this impact on them?
They are certainly not happy about this decision. They have been fighting this decision from the start. They are saying not only intellectual property protection is important for innovation, this takes away the incentive for companies to invest and innovate and do R&D and so on. But they also say that waiving intellectual property protections could backfire because it could create a backlog to create even more a shortage of supply of the raw materials to make vaccines, could make black market vaccines, could do all sorts of things that would actually hinder the production of vaccines around the world quickly and effectively. They are saying that the best way to vaccinate the world is not through vaccine patent waiver, but through technology transfers and licensing agreements, such as ones that have been done by AstraZeneca and the Serum Institute of India, or let's say Sinovac with Indonesian Biopharma. They want that kind of licensing agreement because obviously they have more control over it. They get to set the production, the scheduling, who sells it, how much to sell it for, and so on. So this is definitely a big loss for the pharmaceutical companies, and they have certainly voiced their displeasure at this decision.
Patsy, thanks again for joining us and explaining all of this to us. I know that the story is still developing. Thanks again.
A pleasure.
Well, there are reports that much of the international aid coming into India to help deal with the surge of COVID-19 cases is not getting to those who really need them. Plenty loads of ventilators, medicines and oxygen equipment have been pouring into the country from the US, the UK and many European countries. But as cases continue to reach record levels across India, concerns are mounting about delays in supplying the aid to those most in need. India has been receiving tons of aid, 300 of which have arrived in 25 flights at the Delhi International Airport alone. But for several days, much of the cargo sat in airport hangars as hospitals called for more support. The supplies did not begin being distributed until as late as Monday evening, more than a week after the first batch of emergency assistance arrived. Hospitals in the country are being overrun with patients, with oxygen supplies running low and beds fully occupied as the devastating second wave of the epidemic continues. India's COVID-19 tally has surpassed the 21 million mark as 412,262 new cases were registered across the country in the past 24 hours. It is the second time this month that over 400,000 cases have been counted in a single day, renewing global record of daily infections. The country has also seen its highest daily death toll with 3,980 fatalities recorded since Wednesday morning, taking the total number to 230,168. As concerns grow over the severe shortage of medical resources, the tormented families of the patients are desperately hoping their loved ones can receive treatment. New Delhi has been put under a third successive lockdown until May 10. While some school examinations stand cancelled, others have been postponed amid the worsening COVID situation. The government has ramped up COVID-19 testing facilities across the country as over 296 million tests have been conducted so far. Crowds have been besieging vaccination centers, displaying no signs of social distancing. Video filmed at a vaccine center in the village of Palacodero shows crowds swarming towards the door, the only entry and exit point. Police even tried to control the situation, but people did not listen and continued to gather close together. Neighboring Nepal is being overwhelmed by the surge in India. The country has now recorded 57 times as many cases as a month ago, with 44% of tests now coming back positive. The new wave of coronavirus infections, which has spilled across the Indian border into Nepal, has seen a shortage of hospital beds and medical supplies across the Himalayan nation. Nepal's health ministry says the situation has become unmanageable and the government has enforced a 15-day lockdown, hoping to curb infections. Just an update on India. Pope Francis has encouraged medics to stay strong as they battle the coronavirus pandemic there. He sent the message to the Catholic Bishops' Conference in India, offering his heartfelt solidarity and spiritual closeness to all the Indian people. Meanwhile, more than 16 million UK adults have now had a second COVID vaccination. The latest government figures show 404,226 people received a second jab on Wednesday, taking the total number to 16,291,719. Here's the global update.
Russia has authorized the one-shot Sputnik Light version of its COVID-19 vaccine for use, a move that could help vaccine supplies go further in countries with high infection rates. Developed by Moscow's Gamaleya Institute, the slimmed-down vaccine, which the RDIF says is 79.4% effective against COVID-19 and costs $10 a dose, has been earmarked for export and could increase the number of people with partial immunity. Russian President Vladimir Putin has described his country's vaccines as safe as a Kalashnikov assault rifle. Indonesia has introduced a scheduled internal travel ban today in a bid to curb coronavirus infections at a time when millions would normally travel home to mark the end of Islamic fasting month. Police were deployed across the capital, Jakarta, to check documents and prevent travelers without specific permits from leaving the city. Travel ban was announced last month and will last from May the 6th to the 7th during the National Eid al-Fitr celebrations. Tokyo's Governor Yuriko Koike says an extended state of emergency is needed to contain COVID infections in the city. With current infections straining the medical system in the capital, the state of emergency extension could raise further questions about Tokyo's ability to host the Olympics. Japan had hoped that a state of emergency will contain a fourth wave of cases, but the measure has failed to halt an increase in new infections. Finally, in the United States, while the school year has been disrupted by the pandemic, schools are trying to provide some students with one-on-one psychotherapy sessions to address mental health needs. Schools in some districts like Parkland School District in Pennsylvania have provided a much-needed momentum to boost mental health care for its student population. Educators across the country agreed students' mental well-being became a bigger priority after the pandemic forced schools to shut down or operate with a mix of remote and in-person learning. Some students struggled to focus, and isolation, worry, and depression took a toll on many.
In other news, the UN says the stark warning from the 2021 Global Report on Food Crisis released on Wednesday revealed that conflict or economic shocks that are often related to COVID-19 along with extreme weather are continuing to push millions of people into acute food insecurity. He says the number of people facing acute food insecurity and needing urgent life and livelihood-saving assistance has hit a 5-year high in 2020 in countries beset by food crisis. The conflict, economic shocks, and extreme weather pushed at least 155 million people into acute food insecurity in the last year.
This year that we just published shows a serious increase in the number of people indeed affected by acute food insecurity. In the 55 countries and territories covered by the report, the number of people in acute food insecurity rose to 155 million in 2020. In terms of geographic distribution, what strikes is that 10 countries and territories were actually home to 103 million of the 155 million people. So it means over 65% of those in acute food insecurity were just in 10 countries. The DRC, Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria, Sudan, Northern Nigeria, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Zimbabwe, and Haiti.
We have more coming up on The World today, including this story you don't want to miss. Wine made in space goes under the hammer at Christie's. Welcome back to The World Today. We continue at the International Criminal Court, where a Ugandan former child soldier who later became a commander of the rebel Lord's Resistance Army has been sentenced to 25 years in jail. Dominic Ongwen, known better as White Ant, was convicted in February of more than 60 crimes, including murder, torture, rape, and sexual enslavement. Prosecutors argued that Mr. Ongwen received a lower prison term because he had been abducted by the LRA as a child. The rebel movement was formed more than 30 years ago, operating in Uganda and neighboring countries.
Of committing him to spend the... However, it is also confronted with a perpetrator who himself had previously endured extreme suffering himself at the hands of the group of which he later became a prominent member and leader. By no means does Dominic Ongwen's personal background overshadow his culpable conduct and the suffering of the victims. It is worth repeating this again. Nevertheless, the specificity of this case, of his history, of his situation, cannot be put aside in deciding whether he must be sentenced to life imprisonment for his crimes.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the United States was actively looking to increase security assistance to Ukraine. Speaking alongside Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on a visit to Kiev, Mr. Blinken also said that Russia had left significant numbers of troops and equipment near Ukraine's border, despite announcing a withdrawal last month. And much earlier, he had said the U.S. will respond to reckless or aggressive acts by Russia, and that the U.S. was focused on actions such as the treatment of opposition figure Alexei Navalny.
We spent some time talking about the threat that Russia continues to pose to Ukraine. We've been watching this very, very closely and very, very carefully. We're proud to have supported Ukraine in the face of years of Russian aggression and pressure, from the invasion of Crimea to hostilities in the Donbass. We'll continue to strengthen our security partnership in close collaboration with you to make sure that Ukraine can defend itself against aggression. We're aware that Russia has withdrawn some forces from the border of Ukraine, but we also see that significant forces remain there, significant equipment remains there. We're monitoring the situation very, very closely.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says the country will not leave unanswered attacks on its leadership, its parliament members and companies. Mr. Sergei Lavrov said the U.S. did set a trend of imposing unilateral restrictions, sidestepping the United Nations Security Council and the European Union, which he says willingly followed it. He said he mentioned this at a joint news conference with his Armenian counterpart Ara Avanian in Yerevan. Mr. Lavrov said the tensions between Russia and Western countries started after the takeover of Ukraine and the followed developments. Washington has been Kiev's most powerful backer since Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the outbreak of the Donbass conflict between Ukrainian soldiers and Russian-backed separatist forces that Kiev says has killed 14,000 people in 7 years. Elections are today in Scotland, and First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says she will not propose a referendum on Scottish independence immediately should her Scottish National Party secure a parliamentary majority in today's election. And while the 50-year-old says she wants to make sure the country is clear of the coronavirus pandemic, the SNP has pledged to hold a new vote by the end of 2023. If they get a clear lead in the 129-member Scottish Parliament, as such an event would create significant questions for the future of the United Kingdom. Most pollings show the prospect of the SNP reclaiming the majority it lost in 2016 on a knife edge, but a projected strong showing from the Scottish Greens means a pro-independence majority is likely. Palestinians today buried a 16-year-old Palestinian teen who was shot by Israeli troops during clashes in the occupied West Bank. The teen was shot on Wednesday. Clashes erupted during an Israeli search for a Palestinian suspect of West Bank shooting on Sunday, May 2nd. An Israeli teen wounded in Sunday's shooting attack died of his injuries Wednesday night. An Israeli spokeswoman says the troops operated to stop the suspects by firing towards them, adding that the incident near the Palestinian village of Beitar, south of Nablus, would be investigated. Residents of Beitar and the nearby village of Odalis say there have been clashes between Palestinians and Israeli troops near the village's entrances in the past several nights. Israeli security agency, also known as Shin Bet, says it has arrested a Palestinian suspect over the shooting, identifying him as a 44-year-old resident of the Palestinian village of Thomas Aya. I talk about tasting wine that is from out of this world, literally. If you want to know how that tastes like, then maybe get some real cash in your pockets and head on down to Christie's Auctions, where a bottle of Petra's 2000 red wine, which spent 14 months maturing in space, is up for sale and could fetch around $1 million. The unprecedented offering of the exclusive world-class red produced from Merlot grapes in the Pomerol wine-growing region of Bordeaux was announced in London on Tuesday.
Well, so 12 bottles of Petra's 2000 were sent up into space. They spent 14 months in the conditions up in space. So zero gravity, different, obviously, levels of radiation, different temperature. So the temperature was kept between 18 and 20 degrees, so relatively constant. So the conditions were very different from the bottles that were kept here on Earth. So the maturation process actually has turned out to be slightly different. There's not significant differences. I mean, both the space Petrus and the terrestrial Petrus are both tasting fantastically well. But it turns out the ones that were sent into space, they have seemed to evolve more quickly. So with time in bottle evolution, the wines do tend to turn from sort of purple reds when they're really young to mahogany garnets when they're older. So the ones that went into space were slightly more on the sort of mahogany garnet range, and also had slightly more tertiary characteristics. So tertiary characteristics are what things like leather, cedar, cigar box that come with bottle maturation, and the ones that returned from the International Space Station were slightly more involved, so had more of that tertiary characters.
Well, I wonder if you get the same feeling tasting both wines, even though he says they're the same. Well, there are 12 bottles sent to the International Space Station where aged in a carefully monitored and controlled environment. But that's your world today. Thanks for watching. I'm Amarachi Ubani.